ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy. So The Mandalorian is slowly revealing the somehow Palpatine return. So we'll be taking a look back at all of the clues and hidden details that foreshadowed Palpatine resurrection, and how Supreme Leader Snoke is likely a clone of Darth Sidious' former master, Darth Plagueis the Wise. And then a little later, we're going to talk about the name drop of Project Necromancer from the penultimate episode of The Mandalorian Season 3, as well as what Moff Gideon is up to with his secret cloning project. So in The Mandalorian Season 3, Episode 3, we catch up with the cloning scientist Dr. Pershing. You'll remember him from Season 1 when he was extracting blood from Grogu, and in Season 2 when we see a hologram message of him to Moff Gideon discussing M-counts.
I highly doubt we'll find a donor with a higher M count, though.
M-counts meaning midi-chlorian count.
What are midi-chlorians?
Midi-chlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
Now, in this episode, we see Dr. Pershing as part of the New Republic's amnesty program for former Imperials. In Imperial housing, he reconnects with Elia Kane. They serve together under Moff Gideon. Throughout this episode, we're reminded that Pershing is an all-around good guy who's happy to be part of the New Republic, but he does miss his work as a cloner. He even gives a lecture on cloning and cheating death in the same theater that Palpatine tells Anakin about cheating death, and when he tells him about Darth Plagueis the Wise. It's also in this scene that we hear Snoke's theme for the very first time, but more on that in just a sec. At the end of this bottle episode with Pershing and Kane, we see Kane betray Pershing and discover that she was using him to gather cloning equipment from an old Star Destroyer, and we later learn that Moff Gideon did indeed escape on his way to trial. So Kane and Gideon are still pursuing their mission to resurrect Palpatine, or so we thought. In the penultimate episode of The Mandalorian Season 3, we saw the return of Moff Gideon. And we also hear mention of Project Necromancer from Brendol Hux, the father of the sequel trilogy's Armitage Hux. Necromancy means to bring back from the dead, so I think it's safe to assume that this is in reference to resurrecting Emperor Palpatine. In the Bad Batch, which takes place just after Revenge of the Sith, we see that the Kaminoan Nala Se has been tasked with working on Emperor Palpatine's secret project on Mount Tantus, a project that she says is impossible.
What he seeks is not possible.
That project probably being to create a clone body that Palpatine can transfer to in the event of his death. Now, Mount Tantus was a cloning facility that first appeared in the Thrawn trilogy, which is now Legends material. So we could see it appear in the upcoming Ahsoka series and Dave Filoni's new Star Wars movie, which will very likely feature Thrawn as the big bad. Now, we know that some type of clone body was successfully constructed before Emperor Palpatine died in Return of the Jedi, because that's where his consciousness went after his fall down the reactor shaft. But the cloned body still weren't meeting the standards to harbor the power of a spirit like Palpatine's, but we have more on that coming up a little later in the video. Anyway, Brendol Hux asks about the status of Dr. Pershing and his cloning work, officially confirming that he was indeed intended to resurrect the Emperor, but it appears that Moff Gideon had something different in mind. When Hux questions Gideon about doing some cloning of his own, Gideon is quick to dismiss that allegation.
The creation of clones is your obsession, not mine.
But we know that he's lying because he just walked past tanks of cloned bodies. He lied about Pershing, and we know that this lab on Navarro that Hux asked about does in fact exist, because we saw it last season. So during Gideon's "allow me to explain my evil plan" speech, he says that he utilized Beskar to create a new age of Dark Troopers, likely inspired by Luke Skywalker cutting through them like butter in the Season 2 finale. Gideon says that Beskar isn't the only improvement.
And the most impressive improvement is that it has me in it.
But wait, how can he be in every Dark Trooper suit? Okay, cloning.
That's right. We think that Gideon isn't actually interested in using clone technology to resurrect the Emperor, but to create his own clone army, clones of himself that possess high midi-chlorian counts as well as Mandalorian armor.
So does that mean that Gideon's work has nothing to do with Snoke and Plagueis?
No, not necessarily. It's possible that we'll see Gideon defeated and all his research be taken by those running Project Necromancer. And that addition of Pershing's work for Gideon will be the missing piece that they needed for...
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And like I said, technically speaking, Palpatine has already returned. He is alive during The Mandalorian. The mission the Imperial remnants seem to be working on are either creating Palpatine a better body to transition his spirit into, or they may not even know that Palpatine is still alive and they are simply blindly following orders. In The Rise of Skywalker, it's clear that Hux, Kylo Ren, and the other First Order generals were caught off guard by Palpatine's return.
Dang, this sure is convoluted and confusing, and I am so small.
You're not alone, buddy. It's very convoluted and confusing. Palpatine. So let's finish this video before something else changes. So let's talk about that theater. In Revenge of the Sith, we see Anakin and Palpatine sitting together in the same theater where we saw Pershing giving his cheat death lecture in The Mandalorian.
Her heart gave out. Had simple organ cloning been available on my home world, her death would have been easily preventable.
Palpatine tells Anakin about the Sith legend of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Now, the significance of this story in Revenge of the Sith is that it serves as one of the final nails in Anakin's coffin before making his transition into being Darth Vader. Palpatine has been placing nightmares in Anakin's mind, nightmares of Padme's death. These nightmares make Anakin desperate to find any way possible to stop his visions from coming true. This was already set up in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. After Anakin's mother dies, we hear him say to Padme,
"I will even learn to stop people from dying."
Palpatine uses Anakin's fear to coerce him into joining him once and for all. Palpatine tells Anakin that Plagueis was so powerful, he was able to prevent the ones he loved from dying. Anakin is a bit surprised to learn this is possible, to which Palpatine replies,
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
And we hear Palpatine utter this exact same line in The Rise of Skywalker when Kylo Ren finds his clone body on Exegol.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
We then hear Anakin ask if it's possible to learn this power, to which Palpatine replies,
Not from a Jedi.
Now, many fans have long speculated that this scene also revealed the truth behind Anakin's creation. Like many Chosen One saviors throughout the myths of man, Anakin was a product of immaculate conception, a virgin birth.
A virgin's, you say?
What's a virgin?
Most of our audience.
That's hurtful.
Palpatine says,
He could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life.
It is possible he was conceived by the midi-chlorians.
Now, the way Palpatine looks at Anakin in this shot heavily implies that he and Plagueis were responsible for the creation of Anakin Skywalker. And I mean, look at the show they're watching in the theater. Not to get too personal, but that's clearly meant to represent an ovum with sperm cells swimming around, a fertilized egg which will give rise to life.
Talk about an Easter egg.
Good one, high five.
But why would two Sith Lords want to create the Chosen One?
Well, that's a great question, Doug. The prophecy states that the Chosen One would destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. But it's possible that Palpatine and Plagueis had no intention of creating the Chosen One, but instead a vessel that Plagueis could transfer his consciousness into.
Hey, I'm confused. Is the whole Darth Plagueis the Wise story about cheating death or creating new life?
Well, both. If it were possible to influence the midi-chlorians to create new life, then theoretically you could use that same power to regenerate your own body as well.
Oh, like Force healing?
Yes, exactly. Except Force healing is a light side ability, sort of like Force lightning is a dark side ability. You have to channel different emotions within yourself to master these abilities. So it makes sense that Plagueis and Palpatine's hatred prevented them from being able to master this ability. And the reason Anakin never learned Force healing is because, for one, it wasn't a power that was taught or even discussed during his time as a Jedi. And in canon, this ability and instruction on how to master it was locked away in the sacred Jedi text on Act 2. Rey learned about this ability after taking the books with her in The Last Jedi, and Kylo Ren might have learned it either from witnessing it firsthand when Rey healed him, or perhaps Luke taught him.
Wow, if Anakin knew about this ability, he never would have become Darth Vader.
Yeah, but then we wouldn't have the original trilogy, and we wouldn't have this original trilogy t-shirt that you can get at our merch store at shopzeroedition.com. We have lots of great high-quality tees available, including this Top 5 shirt where you can write your top 5 movies and TV shows, our Somehow Palpatine Return shirt, and one of my personal favorites, Doug as a Foundling. It really does help out our channel if you check out the merch store, so please visit us at shopzeroedition.com/ScreenCrush. Like I was saying, an alternative to keeping your body from dying is a dark side ability known as an essence transfer, the ability to transfer your consciousness or a piece of yourself into an object or another life form, sort of like Voldemort's Horcruxes.
One splits one's soul and hides part of it in an object.
This is ultimately what Emperor Palpatine was able to do in Return of the Jedi. When Darth Vader threw Palpatine down that reactor shaft, Palpatine transferred his consciousness to a clone body he had waiting for him on Exegol, Exegol being the planet where Palpatine resided in Rise of Skywalker. Now, I need to mention that in the Plagueis novel, which is now considered Legends material, but anyways, in the novel, Plagueis actually wasn't a big fan of essence transfer. He much preferred the idea of learning to influence the midi-chlorians to regenerate his own body, keeping it young and healthy. Sort of like what Ben Solo and Rey's dyad in the Force was able to do for Palpatine.
The power of two restores the one. true emperor.
That seems kind of stupid and felt really forced.
Really? Forced? Are you trying to force a pun on us?
Who cares if I am? I'm the manager. I can do all the puns I want.
You're right, sorry.
So wait. That decrepit old body in Rise of Skywalker was a clone of Palpatine and not even his original body?
Yes, his original body was blown up with the Death Star. So even though Plagueis wasn't crazy about essence transfer, that may have been a last resort kind of thing that he had as a backup, meaning that he may have influenced the midichlorians to create Anakin Skywalker, a new young body with a very high M count that he could transfer his mind into. But then, like Palpatine said,
then his apprentice killed him in his sleep.
Palpatine then could have begun his mission to turn Anakin to the dark side, not only to deprive the Jedi of their chosen one and take over the galaxy, but to prepare his new apprentice to become an eventual vessel for himself. And then Mustafar happened. Palpatine now had to go back to the drawing board on where his consciousness would go after his body died.
Why couldn't he just create another Virgins in the Force, like Plagueis did?
Because he didn't know how. In Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine says to Anakin,
To cheat death is a power only one has achieved. But if we work together, I know we can discover the secret.
This is a little contradictory, considering he told Anakin that Plagueis taught his apprentice, which was Palpatine, everything he knew. However, it was possible that Palpatine, like most Sith, allowed his arrogance to get the best of him. He was too sure of himself and believed that he could do anything his former master could. He believed that he had become more powerful than Plagueis, but he was wrong.
I was wrong.
So Palpatine may have realized after killing Plagueis that he had yet to truly master everything that his master had taught him. And then he just lied to Anakin because he's a jerk. So, without the help of his former master, Palpatine was unable to achieve this power, but he hoped that with his new apprentice, Darth Vader, that they could discover the secret. Long story short, they don't. So now let's talk about cloning and Palpatine's decades-long plan to cheat death. Like I mentioned earlier, in Mandalorian Season 3, we see Dr. Pershing giving a lecture on cloning. This is happening in the exact same opera house that Palpatine tells Anakin about Plagueis. This is yet another clue that Pershing and the remnants of the Empire are working on a body for Palpatine to return to his full form. A powerful body, a body with an M count high enough to suit the needs of a powerful Sith Lord.
Or are you talking about the Snoke guy?
Yes, and we get a hint about him as well in this opera scene. In Revenge of the Sith, we can hear this music playing. And then, in Force Awakens, we can hear it again as Supreme Leader Snoke's theme. This was one of the many things that inspired the long-running theory that Snoke was Darth Plagueis.
Remember when everybody thought like Rey's staff was Darth Plagueis' lightsaber? Those are the days, man.
I sure do, and it really should have been, but we can cry about the sequel trilogy later. Now, back to the music. In The Mandalorian, we see vats of cloning test subjects. This is the same episode where we see the hologram message of Pershing that I mentioned earlier. In one of the vats, we see a disfigured body that looks a lot like Supreme Leader Snoke, and we can hear this same ominous music. So we think that Snoke could actually be a clone of Darth Plagueis. You see, finding a body with a high enough M count to suit the needs of Palpatine proved to be very difficult. He couldn't simply clone himself and be done because very rarely do the midichlorians transfer over to different clones, meaning that his cloned body would lack the ability to harness the power of the Force. Cloned bodies also tend to deteriorate rapidly under the pressure of a dark spirit like Palpatine, which explains his state in The Rise of Skywalker. One of the few times in all of Star Wars that cloning a Force-sensitive being actually worked as intended was with Starkiller in the Force Unleashed games. Perhaps Plagueis' body, for whatever reason, proved more successful in the cloning process, and that is why Palpatine used it over his own. Or perhaps Plagueis' body deteriorated just as quickly as any other clone body using the dark side. Palpatine did have several clones of the Snoke body in those tanks on Exegol, so maybe the real reason Palpatine used the body of his old master instead of simply using a clone of himself was to conceal the fact that he had survived. He needed a body that was capable of harnessing his dark side powers, but that no one would recognize. In private on Exegol, Palpatine resided in a clone of his own body, but for his interactions with the First Order and the rest of the outside world, he used a Snoke so that he could conceal his identity until he was ready to reveal that he survived.
Wouldn't someone recognize Darth Plagueis?
Well look, Plagueis was pretty secretive. His public face was actually Higo Damask, similar to how Palpatine kept his true identity of Darth Sidious a secret and for many years portrayed himself as a humble senator from Naboo. So with Plagueis being relatively unknown, Palpatine was able to use him as a disguise. And like I mentioned earlier, if this body is part of Gideon's secret cloning project, that could mean one of two things. It was a misdirect to make us think he was working on Snoke, or his work could be taken and incorporated into Project Necromancer, eventually giving rise to Snoke. And who knows what info on Plagueis that Gideon might have already stolen from Project Necromancer. Now some have theorized that Snoke could stand for Sith no one knew existed. And I mean that fits because Snoke did seemingly come out of nowhere. And that is yet another connection to Plagueis, because he too was a Sith that no one knew about.
The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
So if Snoke was a clone of Plagueis, think about it, he would have died like 60 years prior, and it's likely no one would have recognized him.
Hey, I did a Wikipedia and it says this Plagueis guy was immune. Snoke isn't immune.
Well, buddy, Plagueis has never actually made an in-canon appearance, nor has his species been revealed in canon. So it's possible that in canon he is not part of the immune species.
Fair enough.
Now, back to cloning, there are essentially two types of cloning. The type that grows your clone based on the same DNA from a fetus to a grown adult. Take the clone troopers, for example. While they do age rapidly, about twice the rate of a standard human, they still start off as babies. Then you have the type of cloning that just skips all that and grows a full-fledged adult. Take that Paul Rudd Netflix show, Living with Myself, for example. They clone his body in an afternoon, and it's an exact duplicate of himself at the moment the cloning took place. I think that could explain why Snoke has this gruesome scar in all of his clone bodies. That scar is part of the original body that they cloned, and the cloning process is creating an exact duplicate. If they were using a cloning process that grew a new body just based on the DNA, then something like a scar shouldn't carry over. It's not part of the DNA structure. But if the process for cloning Snoke takes a more of a 3D printing approach, then scarring could and would transfer over. That could explain why Palpatine didn't bother cloning Anakin. One, because like I mentioned earlier, the midichlorians don't tend to transfer, and two, Anakin's burn scars and missing limbs would be part of that cloned body. Now, with all these hints that Plagueis, Pershing, and Sith cloning Snoke and Palpatine are all connected, I think we can safely assume where this scar on Snoke's head came from.
His apprentice killed him in his sleep.
That's right. We think that Sheev Palpatine kept the body of his old master for all these years, likely in the same type of amber casing we saw slain Jedi stored in the Kenobi series. Now, while in the Legends continuity, Plagueis was killed by Palpatine's Force lightning, how he was killed in canon remains a mystery. So, what if instead, Plagueis was killed by a swing to the head of Palpatine's lightsaber? That could explain this mysterious head scar that we see on the head of every Snoke clone.
But in that comic where we see Snoke and Kylo meet in person for the first time, Kylo suggests that Luke is responsible for Snoke's scars.
True, but that can be explained in two ways. One, Lucasfilm made a mistake by connecting all of their media to a canon, and this is merely a retcon. Or, Snoke was very likely lying to Kylo about Luke being responsible for his scars. You'll notice in this comic when Kylo brings it up, Snoke is quick to brush it off and change topics. Snoke likely lied to Kylo Ren and told him that Luke maimed him as part of his many lies. His lies about Luke, Leia, Han, the Jedi, the New Republic, and the light side all together.
But hey, person, wouldn't the real Darth Plagueis still be out there somewhere if he learned essence transfer like Palpatine?
That is a great question, but like I mentioned earlier, Plagueis wasn't really a fan of essence transfer. He preferred learning how to keep his original body alive forever. So it's possible that he never bothered to learn how to transfer his spirit to another body.
But you theorized that he and Palpatine created Anakin so that Plagueis could transfer his consciousness into Anakin's body.
That's right, I did. But perhaps with Palpatine murdering Plagueis, Plagueis was not yet ready for the transfer and was caught off guard by Palpatine's betrayal, meaning he was unable to successfully make the transfer. Or maybe he did make the transfer and a piece of Plagueis lived inside Anakin Skywalker. Perhaps it's that piece of Plagueis within Anakin that played a key role in his transition to Darth Vader.
Whoa, like Plagueis' evil spirit was living in Anakin and is responsible for all his hatred and turned to the dark side?
Could be.
That's awesome. You really should have led with that.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, let me know. Do you think that Snoke was a clone of Darth Plagueis the Wise? Was Anakin created by Palpatine and Plagueis? Could we see Emperor Palpatine make an appearance in The Mandalorian? Let me know your thoughts and theories down in the comments below, or you can @ me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.